Ford Motor Company, known as a symbol of American car power, builds millions of cars every year, filled with what they call revolutionary technology. One of those features, the automatic windshield wiper, a wiper that pauses and starts again, almost like it's dancing with the rain. A small feature, easy to miss, but from that small invention came one of the most painful legal battles a lone inventor ever faced. And one name that should have been remembered in automotive history was slowly erased. This technology didn't come from a big lab. It didn't come from a team of top engineers. It came from the garage of a quiet engineering professor named Robert Kearns. When Ford began using his invention without permission, Kearns decided to fight back. Alone, with no lawyer, taking on $1 billion company, while his marriage fell apart and his children drifted away. Because for Kearns, it was never about the money. It was about something money couldn't buy: recognition. And when the judge finally ruled in his favor, the world suddenly asked, who is Robert Kearns? It was a rainy night. Heavy wind pushed the rain across the roads, and the streetlights looked blurry behind the curtain of water. Inside an old sedan, a man named Robert Kearns was driving carefully through the storm. His windshield wipers moved, too fast at first, then suddenly stopped. Their rhythm made no sense. Too fast, too slow. Every time water hit the glass, he could barely see the road ahead. Then, from the other direction, another car flashed its headlights. It came too close. Robert quickly turned his steering wheel. The car slid a little, then stopped at the side of the road. The engine was still running. The wipers still moved. But his chest was rising and falling. His breath was shaky, his hands tight on the wheel. He stared through the glass. The wipers paused, then moved, then paused again. It was chaotic. But in that moment, something clicked. He narrowed his eyes, focused, and then quietly he said to himself, "It blinks." Like an eye, just one sentence. But it was enough. An idea had just been born. So who was Robert Kearns? He wasn't famous. He wasn't a professional inventor. He was a simple engineering professor at a small university in Maryland. He spent his days teaching students and his nights in his garage. That small room, full of wires, tools, and papers, was where the world finally made sense to him. But there was something else most people didn't know. Years earlier, while serving in the military and celebrating his wedding in Paris, a champagne bottle exploded by accident. The glass hit his eye. Doctors told him his vision would never be the same again. Since that moment, Robert saw the world differently, more carefully, more gratefully. He knew what it meant to lose clarity. And on that rainy night, when his car nearly crashed, that memory came rushing back. He didn't want anyone else to go through the same fear. A few days later, his garage was full of energy. Wires everywhere, tools on the table. He worked alone, building a small device using parts from around the house. His goal? To create a windshield wiper that could think. Not like a machine, but like a person, like the human eye, blinking only when needed. Our eyes don't blink all the time, he said to himself as he worked. They stop for a moment. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow. That's what this wiper needs to do. Using a timer, a relay, and an old motor, he created a small circuit. He installed it in his own car. Turned it on. Click. Wiper moved. Stopped. Then moved again. Smooth. Calm. Almost human. Robert didn't cheer. He didn't jump. He just sat there, staring at the windshield. And smiled. A small smile. But deep inside, he knew this was no longer just an idea. That evening, at dinner, Robert shared the invention with his wife and kids. "Imagine," he said, picking up a spoon to explain, "if our eyes blinked non-stop. That would feel strange, right?" The children looked confused. His wife, Phyllis, laughed. "You're really serious about wipers?" she asked playfully. Robert nodded. "Yes, very serious." He then explained how the system worked, how it followed the rhythm of the rain, and how the pause made all the difference. Phyllis stopped laughing. She looked at her husband. His face lit up with passion. And in that moment, she understood this wasn't a silly idea. It meant something to him. She reached out and held his hand. "Then go for it," she said. A few days later, Robert visited a local engineering workshop. He wanted to show his prototype to other engineers, hoping they might see what he saw. But the reaction? Interesting. One man said, sipping his coffee, "But do you really think car companies care about wipers? It's just a small feature." Others nodded politely. No one was impressed. Robert didn't argue. He packed up his things quietly, but his eyes told a different story. He wasn't giving up. That night, Robert sat inside his car again. Rain fell softly on the windshield. He switched on his new system. The wiper moved, paused, then moved again. And through that glass, Robert saw more than just the road. He saw the future. A future that started in a small garage, but one day might live inside millions of cars around the world. He didn't know yet that this small idea would take him into courtrooms, cost him years of his life, and nearly break his family apart. But on that night, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He only knew one thing: this invention mattered, and he would fight for it until the world recognized his name. The rain had stopped, but something inside Robert Kearns was still moving. That night, as the last drops slid down his windshield and his homemade wiper blinked in perfect rhythm, Robert sat quietly behind the wheel. He knew one thing for sure: the world needed to see this. This small invention, simple, maybe even overlooked, had the power to change everything. He didn't want fame. He didn't want money. He just wanted someone to believe in it, to see what he saw that rainy night during the storm. A few weeks later, wearing his best gray coat and holding a small suitcase full of hope, Robert walked into the tall, glass building of Ford Motor Company. The building stood high above him. Shiny windows, cold steel. Every corner showed strength and power. But Robert wasn't afraid. Inside that case was his dream, a wiper that could think like the human eye. A tiny machine, but full of meaning. He had written his own proposal. He drew the diagrams by hand. The night before, he practiced his presentation with Phyllis. She helped him choose the words, made sure his shirt was clean, and before he left, she said softly, "Don't forget, you're the one who built it." Inside Ford's office, the people were polite. The receptionist smiled. The engineers shook his hand. Robert was taken to a small meeting room. There was a whiteboard, a pot of coffee. He opened his case, gently placed his prototype on the table, like a father showing off his first child. Then he began to explain. He spoke about the dangers of driving in heavy rain, how regular wipers move nonstop, too fast, too noisy, and not helpful. And finally, he shared his solution, a wiper that could stop, wait, and move again, just like the human eye blinks. The room went quiet. Some engineers leaned in. One took notes quickly. Another gave a slow nod. When he finished, one of them smiled and said, "Very interesting. We've never seen anything like this." Then they asked a question. Could they borrow the prototype for testing? Robert hesitated, but they offered an NDA, a legal document that promised to protect his idea. He had no lawyer. He didn't ask many questions. He wanted to believe they were being fair. So he signed and left the Ford building with empty hands, but a full heart. 1 week passed, then 2, then 3. Every morning, Robert waited for the phone to ring. Every afternoon, he checked the mailbox. No calls, no letters, no response. He called them. Once, twice, no answer. He wrote letters, then wrote again. Still, nothing. At first, he stayed hopeful. Maybe they're just busy, he said. It's a big company. These things take time. Sometime later, while walking with his son, Robert passed a Ford showroom. Inside, a brand new car model was on display. He stepped closer, looked through the windshield. His heart sank. The wipers blinked. Not like the old ones. Not like the usual kind. Exactly like his. He froze. His son pulled his sleeve and asked, "What's wrong, Dad?" Robert didn't answer. He just stared at the car, at the quiet betrayal under the bright showroom lights. That night, Robert sat quietly at the dinner table. Phyllis looked at him, worried. Still no word from them. He slowly shook his head. Maybe they just forgot. Phyllis said gently. Robert looked down at his hands. Or maybe They never planned to answer. He didn't sleep that night. He walked around the living room, looking at the NDA, the proposal, the sketches. All the proof was there. But Ford had taken his idea and erased his name. No sound, no shame, no trace. The next morning, Robert stood across the street from the Ford headquarters. The sky was clear. The sun shone brightly on the giant blue logo. In his hand was the same black case. But this time, it was empty. His eyes were sharp. His jaw was tight. And deep inside, he had already made a decision. If they think I'll stay quiet, he whispered, they don't know who I really am. He turned around and walked away, not as a man who lost, but as someone who was ready to fight. When Robert walked away from the Ford building that morning, his steps felt light, but not because he felt peace. Deep inside, he knew he just said goodbye to the life he used to know. The silence from Ford hurt more than any loud rejection. They didn't say no. They just disappeared and took his idea. And for Robert, that was enough. A few days later, he sat alone in the living room, surrounded by documents, sketches, and the NDA he had once signed. His face didn't look angry. It looked calm, but serious. He had made up his mind. He could not let this happen, not just for himself, but for every small inventor who might go through the same thing. Robert Kearns decided to sue Ford. Most people thought he was crazy. When he tried to find lawyers, many refused before he could even explain. You're going up against who? Ford? Alone. You know they have teams of lawyers ready to destroy you, right? But Robert didn't stop. When no one wanted to help, he started studying the law himself. He read books, learned how the system worked, and prepared the lawsuit on his own. At night, the living room became his courtroom. Stacks of papers on the table, cold coffee in the corner, and Phyllis watching him from a distance. At first, he still went to work. He was a college professor, but slowly he began missing classes. His heart was no longer in the classroom. Finally, he made another hard decision. Robert Kearns quit his job. That afternoon, he packed his things from his office, his engineering books, family photos, and a small model of his wiper. He walked down the hallway of the university, head slightly down. I can't teach. Well, my own name is being erased, he whispered. As days passed, the Kearns home no longer felt like home. The dinner table turned into a legal desk. Papers were everywhere. The children began avoiding him, not because they were angry, but because they didn't know how to talk to him anymore. Phyllis still tried to support him. She made him tea every night. Sometimes she massaged his shoulders after long hours of work. But she could see it. Robert had changed. His eyes no longer looked at her. They were always focused on something far away, something no one else could see. Money became tight. Savings started to disappear. Meals became simpler. One night, one of their children asked softly, "Are we having bread again for dinner, Mom?" Phyllis smiled, but behind that smile, she held back tears. Robert heard the question, but he didn't respond. He was too tired, too deep in the fight, too far from the family he once built. And then, Ford made an offer, a settlement, a check with a big number, enough to end the case, enough to save the house, enough to send the kids to college. But there was no apology, no admission, no words like "we're sorry," just money. Robert held the check. Phyllis sat beside him, quietly. No one spoke. Finally, Robert looked at her and said, "If I take this, it's like I never existed." He gave a check back, and in that moment, he burned the only bridge that offered peace. Then, the trial began. On the first day, Robert walked in alone. Ford arrived with 3 cars full of lawyers. Inside the courtroom, Robert stood before the jury. He opened his worn-out folder, his hands shaking just a little. But his voice? Calm, clear. "My name is Robert Kearns. I'm not famous. I'm not powerful. But I invented something, and I won't stay quiet while my name is erased from history." The trial was long, slow, full of legal tricks. But for the first time, people listened. The media noticed. Articles were written. Photos of Robert, simple man, gray hair, quiet strength, appeared in newspapers. This man may have just stood up to one of America's biggest companies and won, at least, in courage. But at home, things weren't so bright. Phyllis stood in front of her suitcase. She didn't pack much, just enough to leave for a few days. She looked at Robert sleeping on the couch, papers on his chest. She wanted to speak, but couldn't. She wanted to scream, but had no energy left. Am I still part of this fight? She wondered. In the courtroom, the jury was starting to pay attention. The judge was beginning to listen, and Robert was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, truth would find a place. But to get there, he had to lose more than he ever imagined. Inside the cold courtroom, the sound of Ford's lawyer's footsteps echoed on the marble floor. They arrived with thick files, expensive suits, and one goal: to destroy Robert Kearns' credibility. Mr. Kearns is emotional. He once had mental health issues. He is difficult to work with. They didn't attack his invention directly. Instead, they attacked him as a person, trying to show he was unstable and obsessed. Robert listened calmly. He didn't yell. He didn't fight back with anger. He stood up, held his old patent paper tightly, and spoke in a soft voice. I'm not asking for pity. I just want my name back. He then explained his invention in simple words. How he copied the way our eyelids blink. How the wiper could pause and move depending on the rain. How that system had never existed before and now was in almost every modern car. Some jurors started taking notes. The judge leaned forward, listening more closely, and the media began writing. David versus Goliath in Detroit. The forgotten inventors fight. But while the world was finally paying attention, Robert's home life was falling apart. Every night, he came back to a quieter house. The children stopped spending time at home. And Phyllis? She hadn't been seen for days. Then one evening, Robert walked in and found a handwritten letter on the table. It said, I'm tired, Robert. Not tired of fighting Ford, but tired of fighting alone. You always said you wanted our name to be respected. But do you still remember that I'm part of that us? I'm leaving. Maybe not forever, but I need to feel human again. Robert didn't cry. He just stood there, reading the letter quietly. A few months later, Phyllis filed for divorce. There were no fights, no loud arguments, just two people, too tired to hold on any longer. The next morning, Robert returned to court. This time, he wasn't wearing his wedding ring, and for the first time, the seat next to him was empty. In the final part of the trial, Robert gave his closing statement. I'm not a rich man. I'm not a powerful man, but I believe a name is a part of who you are. And when my name was removed from my invention, part of me was erased too. The jurors looked up. Cameras flashed. Pens stopped moving. I don't want pity. I just want back what was mine, recognition. That night, his home was silent. No voices, no family, no papers on the table. Only a family photo lying face down on the floor, half the frame cracked. Robert stared at the ceiling, alone, waiting for the decision. The one that could either restore everything or take it away forever. The next morning, the phone rang. A voice from the courthouse said, Mr. Kearns, the jury has returned. The verdict will be announced this morning. Robert stood up slowly. He picked up his patent copy, adjusted his tie, and walked out the door. Outside, the sun hadn't risen fully yet, but the cameras were already waiting. The world was watching, and Robert Kearns was ready to hear the one word that could change history. The house was silent that morning. Robert Kearns stood in front of the mirror, fixing his tie with hands that shook a little. He opened a drawer, took out his old patent paper, edges yellow now, but still precious, and walked into the cold air outside. Cameras waited at the courthouse steps. Years ago, no one cared about him. Today, everyone wanted his name. Inside the courtroom, Robert sat alone. The seat beside him, once for Phyllis, was empty. The judge entered. The jurors came in, holding a single sheet of paper. A hush filled the room. We find that Ford Motor Company has infringed the patent of Robert Kearns. For a long second, nothing moved. Then reporters began to whisper. Robert did not cheer. He closed his eyes, and one quiet tear rolled down his face. He had one, but he had one alone. News flashed across the world. David beats Goliath in Detroit. Inventor of the automatic wiper wins. That night, Robert sat in his living room, The TV loud, the house empty. Family photos on the shelf were covered in dust. The victory felt big on the screen and small in his heart. Months later, Robert sued Chrysler too. This time the public called him a symbol of fairness. He won again, but each court day made his body weaker, his hair whiter. His name was now safe, but his old life was gone. When the lawsuits ended, Robert chose a quiet life. He did not return to university or start a new company. Instead, he gave small talks about honesty and patents. He lived alone in Baltimore. Sometimes his children visited, but lost time never fully returns. In his small study, he hung the patent in a wooden frame. Under it, he placed a handwritten note: "To every little person out there, never let them erase your name." Robert Kearns died on February 9th, 2005, age 77, from a brain tumor. No live broadcast, no big award show, only quiet respect from those who knew his fight. The windshield wiper moved again. Pause. Then moved once more, just like Robert imagined it would, years ago, in a stormy night full of doubt and hope. A simple motion, almost invisible, but behind it was the story of a man who refused to be forgotten. And maybe stories like this remind us that even the smallest invention can carry the biggest fight. Even one voice can stand against giants. Even one name is worth protecting. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Got an inventor or invention you'd like us to cover next? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your ideas. And if there's anything you want to discuss or ask, the comments section is open. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time.